You're listening to The Inspire Me Show with hostess Layla Ashley, hypnotherapist, life coach, author, and speaker. The Inspire Me Show is dedicated to bringing passion and inspiration into your life and your relationships. While side effects of listening to this show may include greater feelings of love, joy, and creative inspiration, please note that this show is meant to entertain and inform and is not a replacement for professional help. Learn more at www.laylaashley.com. And now, right here on KPFK, in the spirit of love, empowerment, and freedom, your hostess, Layla Ashley.
Welcome back to the Inspire Me Show, everyone. Today I have a wonderful guest, Robin Robertson. And Robin Robertson is a Ph.D., a Jungian-oriented clinical psychologist. He's a former computer executive for a large company who now consults on computer issues for a major pension plan. He's also a writer, lecturer, and professor. He was formerly adjunct professor at both the California Institute of Integral Studies and for the Jungian Studies program at Saybrook University. He is general editor and editorial board member for Psychological Perspectives and a contributing editor for Cybernetics and Human Knowing. Robin has published 18 books and over 200 articles on Jungian psychology, science and mathematics, the arts, and his hobby as a stage magician. He lives in Alhambra, California with his wife, Catherine. So welcome to the show, Robin.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy that you're here. This is wonderful.
You were part of a good audience for me one time.
I was, yes, very recently, and you were giving...
I was so proud of that audience because it was one of the hottest days of the year. We had no air conditioning,
yes,
and nobody left.
Yeah, we all stayed. It was that important. And it was a wonderful talk that you gave on synchronicity at the Jung Institute, which we learned a lot from, and it was very fascinating, very informative, very insightful. So let's just dive right into this. Let's start with a bit about your background and what drew you to the field of psychology and Jungian studies.
Okay. I go back between 30 and 40 years. I have to count sometimes. I think about like 35 years or so, my connection to Jungian psychology. I was a vice president of computer-related work, computer program development for a large company many years ago, and I was unhappy. You know, I didn't feel like I was doing what I was intended to do, what I'd been put on earth to do, and I ended up myself going into a Jungian analysis, and that fit. I can remember the very first time I met with the analyst, he said, well, you know, we're going to be working a lot with dreams, you know, so would you record your dreams and bring them to our next session? And I said, well, I don't remember my dreams. And he said, well, if you do, you know, keep a notebook by your bed and do it. Well, that night I had 5 dreams. And for the next 25 years or so, I averaged 3 dreams a night. And
wow.
Only in recent years I haven't needed to as much. You know, it's like after a while you get a connection with something inner and you don't need that extra information. But anyway, that started me on the process. And so I eventually went back and went back to school, got a doctorate in clinical psychology, and this is kind of hard to explain, kind of complex. I have never charged a dime for dealing with patients over the years. Just when I was getting my doctorate, the unconscious made it clear to me that I couldn't take money for doing that, which was a shock because here I'd left a profession behind and had no idea of where the money was going to come from. But from then on, I dealt with patients over the years and did other things that brought in money that took care of me. And it convinced me, and it was one of the things I have always helped my patients with. If you're doing the right thing, the thing you're called to do, something bigger than you takes care of you. We spend too much time, I think, a lot of times worrying about the physical things in life, the material things, and of course they're important, but a more important thing is to be in touch with yourself and where you're supposed to be. And if so, then there's something that takes care of you. I don't care what their person's particular spiritual values are, but there's always something bigger than themselves that takes care of them. So having gone that way over the years, then inevitably I ended up writing books about what I was dealing with, and then teaching at different places and lecturing and, just going off in a number of different directions. And just today, I had a book that came out a few years ago that was just on Kindle. It was a book about Young and Frodo, about the Lord of the Rings, which is a very important book to me, and how it presented ways to help our individuation process, our growth process. And anyway, I was putting together finally a physical copy of it as opposed to a Kindle, and I was listing all the books that I had written, and I realized, until I saw them, it was listed that way, I didn't realize every one of them in one way or another, and some in very strange ways, are about the connection between the inner and the outer, how those two come together. And it's funny because, again, I don't tend to write the way they traditionally teach you in school, which is you have a concept and you lay out an outline, and then you expand the outline, and then you think about the audience it's intended for. I've never written a word that way in my life. Everything has just come because something inside said, well, this needs to come out. And so now when I look at the whole chain of them, they're all circling around that in one way or another. So that's where I've come to now. And I'm 72. It's hard to believe, the years go by. I still feel like a little kid. And 72 and have gone that whole path, and it's been a good path, and because I've worked with patients and done the lecturing and writing and everything like that, I think I've been able to help people in many different ways. And that's always seemed like the most important thing. That's what I was put on earth to do, is to help people in one way or another. So that's me. That's my biography.
Wow. That's a really powerful one, too. What you say about, and practice, about being yourself and letting the universe take care of you and writing in your own, style that emerges. That is such the key. A lot of people talk about that, but they don't really do it. And you're doing that. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, don't you find that this day and age, say, like I'm old enough that I remember how things were when I was growing up, and people in the 50s and into the, say, almost up into the 60s, where life was pretty traditional. There was a model that you followed. You grew to a certain age, and you got married and had children. You had a job, and you continued that job, and it continued on to the end. And that was a good life, and still can be a good life. But I don't think that's so as much in these days. In this day and time, I meet more and more people who have had some kind of a past like mine, where they went off in one traditional direction, and then at some point they changed paths. They bifurcated off in a different direction. And I think it's because the world is changing. The world is changing in a really major way, and we don't know what it's going to be, what's going to emerge out of it, but it's calling us to look at different directions and to each of us in our own way, I guess, to help form what that new world is going to be, because it's just not as unusual for people to have a life like mine. I think that would have been very unusual in the 50s. But
yeah, I agree. The world is really complex these days, and very open-ended in a strange way, where people can tend to need to find their own way. It's almost like we're lost as a culture. But it gives us the room to really, really find our own way, rather than it being sort of handed us.
And because when things are changing, the Chinese phrase "interesting times," which means difficult times. When times are changing, you get extremes of good and bad.
Yes.
So we have all the awful things going on in the world, and yet shining through them most of the time is some positive aspects that are pulling us toward the new. Way back in the early 80s, when I was doing my training as a therapist, one of the places I was working was a place called Beverlywood, where it was like a halfway home for young adults who couldn't make it in the rest of the world. They had to have some kind of a structure. So it was like I think it had been a motel at one time because they held like 100 people, and it was cut off from the rest of the world, basically. So it was a little world into its own, and I was finding there already people were being pulled by something new. For instance, there was a lot of dreams about the end of the world, about apocalyptic times, Mm-hmm. And in general, when somebody is not an extremely problematic person, when somebody is not as severely disturbed, when they dream about apocalyptic dreams, end of the world, etc., it usually means something big is changing inside them. They're going through a big period in their life where it's going to be quite different than it was before. But the people that I was dealing with there, poor things, they were not going to make any major change in their life. They were pretty much where they were going to be in one way or another in the inner world. So when they were having those apocalyptic dreams, I was already guessing that that was kind of intimations of what was beginning to happen in the world outside, that we were going to have apocalypse of one way or another. And later on, I remember I had a dream where it said that there was going to be times of blood and suffering, etc., and 1 million people were going to lead to the new world to come. And now, 1 million is a nice round number, and it could sit there and be totally just for that. But also, at that point in time, I think there was like 5 billion people on the earth. And when you see like 1 million, it'd be like 1 million out of 5 billion being the number that we're being called by the new. And that didn't seem that bad off to me as a guesstimate of how many people are being called to do something new in one way or another. I mean, I don't want to dig into it, but I bet you have that feeling in your life. The way what you're doing, there's got to be a calling to do that kind of thing.
Definitely.
And there's a lot of them. So it was from the people that were more severely disturbed that I first had that feeling that the times were changing, and they were going to change in ways where some of it was going to be scary and tough, but it was necessary. A big change going on.
Yeah, it's almost like they're conduits to
exactly.
for the message.
That's a perfect word. Yeah. I'm taking a long time to say it. Yeah, they were a conduit for something that needed to come out. And let me say a few more words about exactly how that was with them.
Sure.
When you deal with especially schizophrenic patients of one sort or another, some of them can function fairly high and some of them can't. But often when they would have terribly emotional responses at one time or another, like difficult times would occur, what would come out of them would have nothing to do with what they were as a person. In general, schizophrenics are more intelligent than the average population and tend to be very bright. So you have very bright, intelligent conversations with them. But as soon as they would be hitting one of these difficult times, and out would come something that was totally collective, that you could take it from one person and put it on another one, and there would be no difference. Maybe a few little words here or there, but these collective things, so that they were definitely the type of people who were open to be a conduit for something outside them that wanted to come through.
Right. And there's an ego difference. And often we think of that the ego has to be out of the way to be that conduit in some
That's
way.
right. They didn't have enough structured ego to prevent that from happening. So it would just come through. Like artists of one sort or another, when they're first connected with the new that's flowing through them in art, they're like a conduit that way. But then they have structured ego so that they take it and then they put themselves into it, and they form a process with that. So it's not just what's coming into them from someplace else, but it's also them, and they're a part of that, Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it is.
I don't know if we'll get to it, but if sometime in this, maybe I'll talk about channels and people like that too, because that's the extreme of all this. Yeah.
That'd be great. But I like what you're saying, because I too agree that it seems the chaos that is happening right now kind of leaves an opening for something new and good to enter. It doesn't have, on a societal level, also, we're lacking some structure, just like the schizophrenic is on an individual level. So
it happens everywhere, from that very personal level, building out into the whole world, the whole society. It's a very unusual time. I guess everybody always thinks that they live in an unusual time, but I think literally we really do.
Yeah, I agree. So next, I would love for you to give your insights on how active imagination and dream interpretation is used to bridge the gap between the unconscious and conscious mind.
I'll be happy to. Active imagination was something that Jung considered one of the most original things that he'd come up with. And it isn't discussed as much, because we discuss Jung's ideas on dream work, etc. But active imagination, he thought, was the perfect addition to doing work with dreams. And at the very beginning, again, I have to, everything I end up telling you about Jungian psychology, Jung developed his ideas over a very long time. So you can find places at the beginning and the middle and, toward the end, and sometimes they never contradict themselves, but there's a growth process that's in there. And at the very beginning, he was very interested in looking just at, say, images, literally images that appeared in dreams, and to get more information on them, he would have somebody, say, get in a meditative state, a quiet state, a responsive, receptive state, and go back in and try to go back into that image from the dream. Now, I have to preface that by saying Jung was highly visual, and not everybody is highly visual, so there's going to be other ways to do this same thing. For instance, I'm kinesthetic more than visual, so I don't do it quite the same as Jung. But he'd have them get into go into an image, and there'd be two stages that made it active imagination. The first is to be receptive, to be open to whatever wanted to emerge from within. See how that image started changing and evolving, etc. The other was the active part of active imagination, which is when you had to engage with whatever was happening, that you actually took a conscious, active role in it. You did. That's one of the places where it differs from many types of channeling, where you just let the material come through you and flow through you. But in this case, the key is that you have to do both. You have to be receptive to what wants to come out, and then you have to actively engage in it. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because the two almost are combative, Mm-hmm. One part, we're so used to our ego taking control over it that very quickly we can sit there and start distorting the material, and we're not receptive to what's emerging anymore. Or we can just sit there and say, well, this is coming from some bigger place, I'm not going to really engage with it. And there's a lot of books that have been written where somebody is writing them as part of active imaginations. And some of them are really awful because what has happened is the ego is taken over, and they're sitting there and distorting the material to fit something that they want to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
But once you do learn that process, once you can engage in an true active imagination, it's amazing what can come up. I had a student and patient. He was a student, occasionally a patient. He was attending a workshop that I gave. I often give a workshop called Experiencing the Unconscious, where it's different ways that people can get at inner material. And I was teaching him about active imagination and how they could just, for instance, rather than seeing it visually, they could talk to the unconscious. They could sit there and engage with some part of the unconscious and quietly talk to it and listen to what came back out the other side. And he said, "My God, you mean I've spent thousands and thousands of dollars trying to deal with this issue, and all I had to do was talk with it?" And in fact, for him, it made a life change in him. Just that one night, he was able to deal with an issue that he'd been struggling with for many, many times. So this can be a very powerful thing.
It reminds me of a lot of relationships where, we dance around these issues and we talk around them. And the thing that we often communicate about in relationship difficulties is not the actual issue. And then the minute we directly face it and communicate with it, it's resolved. Everything else irons out. It just reminds me of that, what you said about doing that with the unconscious within oneself, within the relationship with oneself.
That's true. When I've dealt with patients over the years, when you can get them to the stage where they're able to do that themselves, where they're able to engage with the issue, to both step outside the issue and look at it objectively, and then get re-engaged so they're emotionally connected to this thing, because you can't be objective all the time. You have to have both sides. When they can do that, there's no more need for therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, but go on. This is
go on.
This is great. Right. You have more.
Yeah. So, as I said, there's a lot of different ways to do active imagination. The two most easily understood different ways are the visual, and that's what I was saying that he did, where you bring up the image and you let it develop as it wants to develop, Mm-hmm. And the oral. And the oral is, again, like I was saying with the other one, where you hold a dialogue with what's going on. And a frequent way that I've always done that over the years is at the computer, where I sit down and I've already structured a little thing for a page on the computer where I can put me, and then I write down whatever it is I want to ask, and then whoever it is that I'm talking to, and write down their some name for them, and let them talk, and just go back and forth as a dialogue like that. Now, you can just do it inside you can just do it out loud and record it, or you can just do it in your head. But in all cases with the active imagination, it's important, one way or another, to leave a permanent form, just like doing dream work, to sit there, and if it's just in your head, try afterwards to reconstruct it and put it down as a permanent record that you can refer to again, just as you'd refer to a dream in a dream journal. And when people first start doing this, they often feel really silly, like, I'm just making this all up. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that they don't think anything is going on. Yet it is very quickly, and it is once they get past that initial feeling silly and stupid and this isn't doing anything. Pretty soon they start realizing, and I'll say with the voice one because that's the one I'm most comfortable with. The voice that's talking to them is has got something to say that they wouldn't have said otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
When you're dealing with some kind of a problem, you go over it and you worry about it. Maybe you make lists of the positives and the negatives on it, one way or the other. When you're doing an active imagination with someone or something, I say something. One time I remember it was a very important one. I just addressed a sadness I was feeling for quite a while. So once you do an active imagination, what comes out often tells you things that you had no idea were important. Sometimes it agrees with you and you're having like a friendly conversation. Then it can sit there and tell you something totally out of left field that can change your whole purpose. And I'll jump a little to this, which is you're still dealing with some part of yourself for a very long time. Not a part that's unconscious that you don't have access to. That's why this is a good process. But if you do active imagination for a long time, at some point along the way, you're going to encounter something that's not you in any way, that has nothing to do with you, godlike or demonic, or more often I've found the godlike portion, and that's very different, and that can be scary for people too. It's one of the reasons why dream work is safer to do than active imagination, and I don't want to scare people off from doing active imagination, but just the warning that it's a very powerful thing. It's you don't fool with fire, so you don't take active imagination casually, because what can come out of there is deep and powerful and can be wiser than you. There was a period of a few years where I dealt with a lot of multiple personality patients.
Uh-huh.
They now call them DID, patients, but I still think the original multiple personality fits what was going on, because that's what you encounter in there. And they, just like we were saying that severely disturbed patients can be conduits for material that's outside them, the multiple personality patients are able to do, say, in effect, this active imagination is going on with them in a very complex way. In my experience, of all the people with severe disturbances of one sort or another, I admire multiple personality patients the most. I found them the most creative, the bravest, etc. Almost invariably, it would be because they had had some extremely traumatic situation happen when they were young, and it was so awful that the person they were wasn't prepared to deal with that at all. And how brilliantly the psyche works. It produced some personality that could deal with that situation and could protect them from it. And the trouble is, though, that over time, then they never developed a fully integrated ego. The parts stay separate. So there's a part that's able to deal with the situation, and then the part that's their more normal personality, and that one isn't even aware of the other one that's going on. And usually, because it can be such a useful skill, the number of personalities multiplies, and you have a whole variety of personalities, some from very undeveloped to very developed over time. The single patient who I cared about the most and dealt with over the longest period of time was an artist, and she was functioning out in the world. She was able to. She didn't have to be institutionalized. She was able to function and do creative work, but it was a very difficult time for her nonetheless. The main other personality she had was a child personality that went back to that traumatic time in her childhood. And this personality just kept saying over and over again, don't hurt me, Daddy, I'll be a good girl. Don't hurt me, Daddy, I'll be a good girl. thousands and thousands of times a day. So that was going on in the mind of this brilliant artist all the time. She was always hearing that. You can imagine how debilitating that was over time. And we worked together for like a year or so. And by the way, we worked exclusively through email. I never met this patient. She contacted me. A number of them at one time contacted me because they'd read some material I wrote about multiple personalities, and they felt seen in a way they hadn't been seen by other therapists to that point in time. They felt like I understood it. I knew what was going on, and we dealt exclusively through email. All I had to do was put the name of the personality I wanted to talk to in the header, and that's the only one that read it and was aware of it.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
So, yeah, sounds wacko. Sounds very strange. If you nobody could make it up. But that's what happened. And we worked together for, as I said, over a year. And over a year, through various ways, finally that was able to stop. That saying over and over again, don't hurt me, Daddy, I'll be a good girl. That stopped, which made her life much easier. It made the artist's life much easier. But we weren't able to integrate that personality and some others as well into a single person. And I think we both knew that was as far as we could go. But I grew to, I really loved her, and I really cared about her. And as I said, it definitely formed my feeling that multiple personality patients were the bravest, wisest way to deal with these issues. Like if you say a schizophrenic patient, in some way or another, a part of them is denying the reality that's out there. They're when it's really bad, they're going away from that reality and saying it doesn't exist in one way or another. A multiple personality patient is instead creatively creating some other personality that can help them and can solve things for them. So, that's like an extreme of the active imagination, because the different personalities often are not aware of each other. So that's not going back and forth. But there's some part of them. In fact, there's almost always a wise part. You don't always engage with it, but there's almost always a wise part that's aware of all this. And occasionally with her and with another patient that I dealt with, I was able to talk to the wise one, but it was, and she'd give me a little direction on how to improve on what I was doing. But
it's interesting because I think there's a parallel to how we work when we don't have that disorder. We have an observer who is, in our case, is aware of different parts of ourselves, and then we like a tool bag, pull out these different parts. Okay, here's for business, here's for a business meeting, here's for a relationship, here's for being a mother, or here's, we have these different roles, and here's for playing and being our primal self. And so we have all these. I think the biggest difference is we're not aware, and we are, through active imagination as a practice, moving toward integration.
That's right. I mean, yeah, that's an exact parallel. And the other key thing I need to bring in about active imagination, it flows out of Jung's ideas of complexes. And that was the first real brilliant idea that Jung had, which was that we have emotional structures that form within the psyche that group around one thing or another. Maybe it'd group around the concept of mother, or group around the concept of father. And that was what originally got him his relationship with Freud, telling Freud about that. And then Freud oversimplified it and reduced it to basically just one complex. But we have many multiple complexes. And at the beginning, Jung didn't have any concept of archetypes yet. But over time, what he found was, as he got to the core of these complexes in people, at the core was an archetype, something that was collective, beyond the person, that was that cut across all people, and that would be the core. That'd be like the attraction. Like if you had a magnet and you threw steel filings around it, and you'd see them form a pretty complex circular-like pattern around the magnet. Well, that would be what you had with complexes. And multiple personality patients were like extremes of the complex, creating these personalities that clustered around a particular center. And when you're doing active imagination again, you're trying to find a way to get to those complexes in ways you wouldn't normally do it. Dreams, in fact, in his late years, Jung often referred to his psychology as complex psychology, and by which he meant the whole thing was structured around the complexes inside us. And he thought this is a very natural thing. And when you think about how is it that we grow and develop, well, we say we are a person who's functioning at some way in the world, but change needs to occur. Well, in the unconscious, some varieties of possibilities start to form in one way or another. Especially if you look at dreams, you'll see that very clearly. They start to form and change over time, and then they coalesce until you're finally finding something that's ready to be a part of your existing conscious personality, and then it kind of merges into your conscious personality, and you're expanded, and it doesn't need to be a little separate grouping like it is with a multiple personality anymore. It's part of you. And that's just the normal way we grow and develop, is by developing these personalities. And because we are humans, as opposed to, say, some other kind of animal, because I'm sure similar kinds of development occur in many species, but because we're human, we're very concerned with people. People are the things that are most interesting of all to us. So these complexes almost invariably take human form, and you'll get one form or another, and et cetera. And again, everything is related in all this stuff, by the way. But,
yeah.
But does that make sense?
It does.
That this is
right.
Not something strange, and we obviously change over time. We become more like the person we're supposed to be if we're developing the right way. If we don't develop the right way, well, maybe we stay kind of stuck in time. Everybody's seen people, say they went to high school with, and when they see them 20 years later, and they're basically no different than they were when they were in high school with them, and it always seems a little scary, and sad that no development has taken place. But for most of us, life is complex enough that it forces us to change over time and grow, hopefully. And the way it does it is in the unconscious, behind the scenes. Different varieties of things are trying to emerge, and some work better than others. And over time, then we gradually incorporate them into our own personality.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me how difficult it can be, that part of ourselves that we're not aware of. It's hidden, but we're working with that to grow and to integrate and to do this work. So that can be very tricky as well.
Oh, yeah. You're a therapist and a family therapist as well?
Yeah, I'm an LMFT as well as a life coach and hypnotherapist.
Okay. Well, then you definitely know how that process works. When you're working with patients, you're trying to bring out the part that wants to emerge with them.
Right.
And because you're not stuck in wherever they're stuck, you can usually see it early in the game. So it's easier for you to help in that process. Like one of the things that was fascinating to me from the beginning in Jungian psychology was that often the dream somebody will bring at the beginning lay out what the whole process is going to be. If you looked at them, you'd say, "Oh, well, that's what's going on." And of course, when I deal with a patient, I wouldn't explicate that, and I wouldn't say, "Well, this is what's going on," but I'd be aware of it, and it made it a lot easier for me that I could already see what the issues were, because not everybody has the same issues, and over time you could sit there and see that slowly change, develop. And again, that's because it's changing in the unconscious. And I can't tell you how many times that would be so. When they would come, if they bring a dream, it really would help. But even if they didn't bring a dream, it would often be clear from the opening discussions what was really going on. And this, I guess, you should have said at the beginning. And it's most often not what the presenting problem was.
Right.
In other words, they'd come to me with one issue or another, and I'd quickly say, well, no, that's not what's going on.
It's what we call the surface issue.
Yeah, exactly. And slowly the other would emerge, and it would help that I outside, who was somebody who was objective, was already aware of what was going on. The process of doing therapy is a good process, even when the therapist isn't very good. Okay, because people have no other situation where they can come in and they're free to let everything come out. There's probably no other situation in life where that's possible for them. They can let anything come out that needs to come out, and they're kind of protected. And if it's a good therapist, he or she forms a temenos. I love that word. Whatever. It's kind of a sacred holding space. There's something sacred where they feel protected and nurtured and cared for in a way they wouldn't anywhere else, So just that process by itself is good. Now, it helps if it's a good therapist, but, how many people are good at anything, So.
A few of us, right?
Yeah. There's you and me, huh?
Yeah, that's the only ones.
There was a famous science fiction author, Theodore Sturgeon, wrote beautiful stories, by the way, beautiful, caring stories. And he came up with a saying that's been referred to as Sturgeon's Law. And Sturgeon's Law is that 95% of everything is crap.
Oh, boy.
No matter what you're dealing with, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a TV that you're buying or whatever like that, most of it isn't very good. And then there's that small percentage, like 1 in 20 or whatever, that's good. I'm really good at it. And I think therapy is one of those areas that may be more true than other, and that is because a lot of people go into the field because they're not very good at dealing with people. A lot of people feel like they didn't understand other people, and they want to understand people, and so they think if they study psychology that they're going to learn more about people, and they'll learn something about it, but that's not essentially what's necessary to do therapy. The good therapists are people who were empathetic to begin with, had a connection to other people, and it's nice to learn some facts that you can use along the way and some techniques, but that's much less important than having that empathetic connection with people from the beginning. If I can give a biographical thing, I always had that, and I wasn't, even aware of it when I was little. When I was like maybe 9 or 10 years old, I would already have adults. Let's say my parents were having a party or something, and they would drift over to me if I was still awake, and they'd start telling me their stories. I was just a kid, and I didn't know what to do with it or whatever. But the people just felt that natural comfort to do that. And in my experience, the therapists I've dealt with that are good, and it doesn't matter what modality they've chosen to call themselves, that's secondary, all have that in one way or another, which is they're very comfortable in dealing with other people. And then, by the way, it's not even extroverted and introverted, because I'm a very outgoing, extroverted person. It could be just as much so when they're introverted and quiet, but they still got that human connection.
Right. It's really the connection that's important.
Sorry, that was one of those side trails I went off on.
So let's get into synchronicity, what it is, also just how it gives meaning to people's lives.
Well, one of the things, with Jung, a lot of people that have never dug into Jung think, where do these crazy ideas come from, and they don't understand what's going on. I used to have a friend who was a medical doctor and an experimental psychologist out of Canada, and he was very surprised when he found I was a Jungian-oriented clinical psychologist, and he was shocked when I started introducing him to the material. He actually started reading Jung and found, my God, this is brilliant. This is really important stuff. And I said, well, of course. But I said, what's the opinion of most academics in Canada about Jung? He says, oh, it's just that he's crazy. I thought that was funny. I just thought it was crazy ideas. So the idea of synchronicity, it developed over a very long time for Jung. He didn't finally end up explicating it to the broader public until first 1950 in his foreword to the I Ching, and then a year later he gave a speech called On Synchronicity and gave a paper too at the Uranus conferences. These were conferences where they gathered the most brilliant thinkers in the world on various topics every year. And finally, his major paper on it in 55, Synchronicity and Acausal Connecting Principle. But he had to build up to it way back, as early as 1912. And so at that point, Jung is only 37, I think. And he wrote his first book, Symbols of Transformation, and that was the one that led to him breaking with Freud. There, the first piece that led to synchronicity was there. He was dealing with psychic energy, libido, as a more generalized energy. Okay, now that may not sound like it's going to connect with it, but it slowly does. And so he then wanted, right then in 1912, he wanted to sit there and develop a paper dealing with the part of psychic energy where it was connected to time, where you had some part of it that was causal, it was emerging, and another part that was pulling you to the future, teleological. He used the word final for that. So something emerging from the future. Then, in 1916, he did the same thing with something that didn't emerge fully until 57, and that was the Transcendent Function, which is, what connects the inner and the outer, what brings them together. And the key was, that was the first time he brought up active imagination. Active imagination first came out then. And so all of this was preparatory to then dealing with the fact with synchronicity, which was, how in the world can we have connections that aren't causal? How can we have meaningful coincidence? And like science at that point in time really had no room for that at all. Everything had to be causal. It had dismissed teleological functions, things pulling us from the future. It dismissed that as just silly, non-scientific ideas. Now it's not true, by the way. Now lots of that has changed. But so it was very tough for him growing up, as somebody who thought of himself as scientific, to sit there and say, oh, how can I have these connections that are important and meaningful, but they're not causal? I don't have a chain of where something occurs, and it can't be shown to relate in a normal causal way. I mean, the easy ones, things like you're thinking about some idea, it's very important to you, and you're kind of stuck, and at that point in time a friend calls up and they want to talk about just that topic. Or when I was writing a section on synchronicity in a book called Mining the Soul, and I was actually sitting at the computer writing that, and I got an email from an ex-patient who wanted to ask me about synchronicity. Well, the key there is it has to be a coincidence, but it also has to have meaning for both people. If it doesn't have both of those going on, it's not a synchronicity. And synchronicity seems to be one of the guiding principles that moves us in that whole development of, you got the idea of the complexes where things are slowly coming together, and then you have synchronicity where those things that are in the inside there in the complexes start to have a way to merge out into the outer world. And that's synchronicity in its most crude form. And I remember, I don't know if I'd said these at the lecture you went to or not, but I had two wonderful quotes about this. One was from Jung. He says, synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. In other words, it's there all the time. The synchronicities are occurring all the time. And the other one was by Einstein. He doesn't use the word synchronicity, but he just uses coincidence. He says, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous.
I like that one.
He's more quotable than Jung.
Yeah.
God's way of remaining anonymous, meaning there's something going on, and something bigger than you wants it to happen, and
so,
it doesn't care if you're conscious of it or not.
Let me ask you, so it's more like we're tapping into something bigger than us. It reminds me a little bit of the concept of flow, which is more of it's a psychological concept. Have you seen that correlation? And, because that's sort of tapping into nature, or the natural way of things that's always there. But sometimes we see it and sometimes we don't, depending on where we are, right?
That's exactly right. A key there is focus. In other words, when we're more focused, synchronicities abound. And I'm not sure if they're really happening more often, or because we're focused enough to see that they're occurring. Because like in any major transition point in your life, you're getting ready to get to a new job. You're getting ready to have a new relationship. You're going through some major change in your life. Synchronicities are all over the place, and it's like a way of trying to, I guess, form for you a little direction in where you need to go. And they're also, by the way, one of the ones in my experience that people respond to pretty quickly when they hear about synchronicities. A lot of times they'll have problems with a lot of the other concepts that you try to introduce them. But when you mention synchronicities, almost everybody has had key synchronicities in their life. They've had something occur where it wasn't easily explicable, and it was coincidence, and they know it was more than coincidence. A lot of times they've had it with a death. A death occurred in their family, and they were aware of it before they had the information about a death. That's a very common one. I remember when my wife's mother was in the hospital, and she was very sick, but we didn't realize she was dying. And we were in bed, and suddenly, there was like a cold feeling in the room, and we knew it was like she had died, and there was a presence there that was telling us she had died. And when we checked with the doctor the next day, sure enough, at that point in time, when we had felt it, that's when the death had taken place. So something powerful, powerful that needs to get across to you, and one of the easiest way for it to get across to you is a synchronicity. And another thing about synchronicities, you can't control them. There's absolutely no way to take control of synchronicities, to create them, etc. What you can do, though, is be more aware. Open yourself up to seeing those. A woman I knew out of Switzerland, she has precognitive dreams virtually every night, very detailed, so it's not at all strange. So the inner and the outer are so connected for her, maybe down to the level of she'll say, there's something going to be involving number 12 today. And she'll look, and her parking place will turn out to be 12 when there weren't any other parking places available. So very teeny little synchronicities are occurring. They're just very usual. For me, and I think for most people, having like dreams that are that connected, so say predictive and synchronicities connected are much rare. The dreams that I've had that were in some ways synchronistic in their construction, have only been a few, and have been very important in my life, really important in my life, where the dream came up, and it was there to tell me that something important was happening at the same time that I wasn't aware of. So.
Right, and at those points, there's sort of this inner knowing that is different than your normal receiving of information.
Yeah, you want to hear the one that was really important for me, the synchronistic dream, the precognitive dream, you know?
Yes, I do.
All right. This was at a point in time when I had written my first book. Okay, it was a more academic book called C.G. Jung and the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. And that later got rewritten like almost 10 years later, and it's one of my major books called Jungian Archetypes. So anyway, I had written it, and I had sent a copy of it to the publisher, editor, the guy who was running Psychological Perspectives, which is a Jungian journal here in Los Angeles. And his name was Ernie Rossi, and I'd never met Ernie, and all I knew about him was that he was running that journal at that point in time. And this was like the middle of the week. I dreamed that I had a call from William F. Buckley. I don't know if people still remember William F. Buckley anymore, but William F. Buckley was like the early intellectual from the conservative side, and what was key about William F. Buckley was how precisely he spoke about everything. Everything sounded as if he had written it beforehand. So I got a call from William F. Buckley, and he was telling me that he had a journal out, and it was he was very happy with most of it, but he wasn't at all happy with the way that the people were dealing with books, the book reviews and related things with books, and that he had stayed up that night reading my book, and that he thought that I had the right kind of approach to this, and he would like us to work together, and he wanted me to be the new editor, the dream editor. Well, as at that point in time, as I said, I was still having like 3 dreams a night, and I was still in a Jungian analysis at that point in time. So it was like, wonder where that came from. It didn't. I moved on to the other dreams and didn't pay much attention to it. Then Saturday morning, I got a call from this Ernie Rossi, the guy that was the editor-in-chief of Psychological Perspectives. And he told me, I stayed up last night and I was reading your book and I was really excited, and I run this journal and I'm happy with most of it, but I'm not happy with the people, the way people do dreams. Oh, I forgot one aspect of the dream too. And one aspect of the dream was William F. Buckley said the dream editor is Gore Vidal's wife. Okay, and Gore Vidal was a very prissy, somewhat nasty, brilliant writer, and gay, and had a connection with the feminine when he was being especially kind of prissy and everything like that. So Gore Vidal's wife would be somebody that was very prissy and having a hard time with very negative about what they was reading, and that's what Ernie was telling me about. Now, he didn't want me to be the editor of the books. He wanted me to write a series of omnibus book reviews. And I went over to his place in Malibu, and we walked on the beach and talked about all this. And then I joined the board of Psychological Perspectives. And it changed my whole life, because here I'd written just this one highly academic book. And I'm not sure if I'd have written any more, but suddenly I was connected with a place where I could try out new ideas in articles, and if I'd produce a book, I could excerpt it and publish them there. So it was like a center for me to do creative things that has continued for the rest of my life. And here was this dream that was so exact. I remember one time I was at a conference for chaos theory. I was very heavily involved with that for a while. And somehow this came up, and I was telling that story, and a woman there was very skeptical. She was saying, "Oh, you mean that you met him and had this discussion, and then a few days later you had this dream?" And I laughed and said, "No, I had the dream first." And she was like, "How could that be?" And so I felt the need to kind of prove it, though I knew I couldn't get across to her. And I told her I kept my dream notebook on secretarial pads, the ones where they take notes in there, and this was recorded in one day, and then the thing with him was recorded in a later day, and there was no way that I could have done that without ripping them out of the pad and putting it back in. And at that point, she just went, "Huh," and walked off. Like, I'm not going to listen to this craziness anymore. But so that was my big precognitive, synchronistic dream.
Wow. I mean, that's super incredible.
It is.
Goes without saying,
Yeah, but I don't have them all the time, Just a very few. That was the most important of all.
All right, wonderful. Well, I so wish we could talk about so many more things that we didn't get a chance to, and I would love to have you on my show again. But for now, thank you so much for being on the show and presenting all of your insights, wisdom, everything about these wonderful concepts. I'm just delighted. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, it's been a real pleasure for me, too. I really enjoyed it. And all this stuff, one of the reasons why I can talk about so many of these things, for me, at 72, it's all connected. In other words, they aren't like separate little topics anymore. They've all formed a whole. So one thing leads to another and another.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. That's the beauty of staying here a while, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, and I'll look forward to having you on my show again sometime in the future.
All right. I'll look forward to it, too. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The Inspire Me Show with hostess Layla Ashley, hypnotherapist, life coach, author, and speaker. Find out more about Layla's services and products at laylaashley.com. The Inspire Me Show is dedicated to bringing passion and inspiration into your life and your relationships. Join Layla on her next episode of this regular program here on KPFK. Until then, live in the spirit of inspiration.